There is a ship that survived being torpedoed, declared dead, and left to rust on the bottom of the Persian Gulf, only to be raised from the seabed, rebuilt from scratch, and returned to the ocean like nothing had happened. It was the largest self-propelled object ever built by human hands. Longer than the Empire State Building is tall, capable of carrying 4.1 million barrels of oil in a single voyage. And yet, by the time its story ended, it was being torn apart by hand on a beach in India. This is the full story of the Seawise giant. The whole thing starts with a mistake. In 1974, the Japanese shipbuilder Sumitomo Heavy Industries took on a commission from a Greek shipping magnate to build a massive crude oil tanker. The blueprints called for a 412,000-ton supertanker, enormous by the standards of the day, but not unprecedented. The problem revealed itself during sea trials. When engineers tested the ship's astern propulsion, essentially putting the engines into reverse, the entire rear section of the hull began shaking violently. The massive propeller blades were generating harmonic resonance against the hull structure, threatening to tear the steering gear apart. The vibrations were severe enough that the Greek buyer looked at this enormous, expensive vessel and said, "No thank you." Hull 1016, as it was catalogued, sat abandoned at the Sumitomo yard. An unmarketable, vibrating white elephant, a monument to over-engineering. Then Hong Kong shipping tycoon C.Y. Tung made one of the boldest gambles in maritime history. He bought the rejected hull, and instead of fixing the vibration problem by scaling the ship down, he decided to make it even bigger. The technique he ordered is called jumboization. Shipyards had done smaller versions of it before, cutting a ship in half and inserting a new midsection. But nobody had ever attempted it on a vessel anywhere near this scale. Engineers literally sliced the entire hull in two, rolled the bow section away on hydraulic dollies, and welded in a brand new 82-meter midsection. When they reassembled it, the ship stretched to 458 meters in length and displaced 657,000 tons when fully loaded. They christened her the Seawise Giant. She wasn't just the world's largest ship. She was in a category entirely her own. Here is the strange paradox at the heart of the Seawise Giant. She was the most powerful cargo vessel ever built, and she was also one of the most restricted. Her maximum draft, meaning how deep she sat in the water when fully loaded, was 25 meters. That single number closed off most of the world's shipping routes to her permanently. She was too wide and too deep for the Suez Canal, too large for the Panama Canal, too deep drafted even for the English Channel's shipping lanes. She couldn't dock at most of the world's ports because her hull would simply scrape the seabed. She was physically confined to a handful of specialized deep-water terminals, sailing the long way around the Cape of Good Hope because she had no other choice. Her momentum was equally extreme. At full load, if the captain ordered an emergency stop, the ship needed over 9 kilometers of open water just to come to a halt. Her turning radius was measured in miles. She moved less like a vessel and more like a slow-moving island that happened to have a bridge. For a decade, she did what she was designed to do, haul vast quantities of oil across the open ocean. But by the mid-1980s, the world around her was becoming considerably more dangerous. The Iran-Iraq War had been grinding on since 1980, and by the mid-1980s, both sides had turned the Persian Gulf into one of the most contested stretches of water on Earth. Military historians call this phase the tanker war. The strategy was simple and brutal. If you can't beat the enemy on land, destroy their oil revenue by attacking the ships carrying it. Hundreds of commercial vessels were hit during this period. The Seawise Giant, too large and too slow to make rapid transits through contested waters, was effectively useless as a transport ship in these conditions. So her owners leased her to Iran for a different purpose entirely. She would sit anchored near Larak Island as a floating oil storage terminal. Think about what that means. The world's largest ship, fully loaded with crude oil, anchored in shallow water, stationary, visible on radar from miles away, in the middle of an active war zone. She was, in the most literal military sense, the biggest target in the Gulf. On May 14, 1988, the Iraqi Air Force came for her. The aircraft used were French-built Dassault Mirage F-1 fighter bombers, and they were carrying the AIM-39 Exocet, one of the most effective anti-ship missiles ever manufactured. The Exocet is designed to fly just a few meters above the ocean surface, traveling below radar until the final seconds before impact. Its warhead is built to punch through steel plating and detonate inside the hull. The Iraqi pilots detected the Seawise giant's enormous radar signature from well beyond the range of the ship's minimal defensive systems. They released their missiles and turned for home. The Exocets hit. The explosions tore through the hull's internal bulkheads, vaporized surrounding oil, and ignited a fuel-air inferno that engulfed the ship's midsection. The internal firefighting systems were severed almost immediately. By the time Iranian naval firefighting tugs arrived, there was nothing they could meaningfully do. The fire burned for days at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. At that heat, steel doesn't just weaken, it changes permanently at a molecular level. The massive deck plates began warping and buckling. Internal oil tanks ruptured. Hundreds of thousands of tons of firefighting water pumped into the hull disrupted the ship's weight distribution catastrophically. The Seawise giant began to settle, but even here, her extraordinary size worked against a clean ending. The coastal waters off Larak Island weren't deep enough to swallow her completely. Instead of sinking beneath the surface, the hull ground into the shallow seabed, leaving her scorched superstructure and upper decks jutting above the waterline like a burned-out industrial ruin. The world's largest ship had been reduced to the world's largest wreck. International underwriters declared her a total constructive loss. She was abandoned where she lay, a toxic, charred hulk, left to corrode in salt water and spilled crude. Under any conventional maritime logic, the story ends there. In 1989, while the Gulf War ceasefire was still fresh, a Norwegian shipping consortium called Norman International did something that the entire maritime industry considered somewhere between audacious and insane. They bought the wreck. The reasoning was calculated. Yes, the superstructure was destroyed. Yes, huge sections of the mid-body had been permanently weakened by thermal damage. But the heavy keel blocks, the lower hull frames, and the core of the propulsion machinery, all of which had been submerged in the relatively cool seawater during the fire, had survived in better condition than anyone expected. Norman International paid a fraction of the ship's original manufacturing cost and bet millions that the Seawise giant could be brought back. The salvage operation alone was a feat that maritime engineers still talk about today. Divers went into the wreck in zero visibility conditions, navigating through flooded, toxic, oil-saturated compartments to map every missile entry wound, every ruptured bulkhead, every structural tear across all 458 meters of hull. They used underwater thermal cutting torches to clear away twisted steel, then welded heavy patch plates over the exterior hull breaches by hand, bolting them through with thousands of structural fasteners. The critical danger came next, pumping out the ship's interior. If the contaminated water and petroleum sludge were evacuated too quickly, or unevenly. The pressure imbalance could snap the fire-weakened hull clean in half on the seabed. The engineers balanced the pump out meticulously, simultaneously injecting compressed air into intact wing tanks to gradually restore buoyancy. After months of carefully managed adjustments, something remarkable happened. The keel broke suction with the mud. The Seawise giant floated. She was immediately hitched to a fleet of ocean-going tugboats and towed across the Indian Ocean to Keppel Shipyard in Singapore, one of the only dry dock facilities on Earth physically large enough to receive her. What followed was not a repair job. It was a partial manufacturing rebirth. Metallurgical testing confirmed what the engineers suspected. Vast sections of midship plating were permanently compromised. Workers cut away more than 3,700 tons of warped, heat-degraded steel and replaced it with entirely new structural components. The accommodation block and bridge, gutted by fire, were demolished and replaced with a modern, computerized command module. The steam turbines were stripped to their core components, recalibrated, and reinstalled. By 1991, she emerged from dry dock. Not the Seawise giant anymore. That name had died with the fire. She left Singapore as the Yara Viking, and she was in many ways better built than she had been before. The largest ship in the world was back. For the next decade, the Yara Viking operated without drama. She carried hundreds of millions of barrels of oil across the Atlantic and Pacific, moving slowly and reliably between deep-water terminals. The resurrection had worked. But while she was being rebuilt in Singapore, a disaster was unfolding on the other side of the world that would eventually kill her. Not with missiles, but with legislation. In March 1989, the supertanker Exxon Valdez ran aground in Prince William Sound, Alaska, and spilled 11 million gallons of crude oil into one of the most pristine marine environments in North America. The images were devastating. The political response was immediate. The United States passed the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. The International Maritime Organization rewrote the global MARPOL Treaty. The mandate was clear and non-negotiable. All single-hull supertankers were to be phased out and permanently banned from international waters. The Yara Viking was a single-hull vessel. Only a single layer of steel plating, less than 3 inches thick, separated her 4.1 million barrels of cargo from the ocean. If she suffered a grounding or collision, there was no secondary inner hull to contain the spill. Her owners ran the numbers on a retrofit. To make her legally compliant, they would essentially need to build an entire second steel hull inside the existing cargo tanks, removing all the internal piping and structural bulkheads, rebuilding from the inside out. It would reduce her cargo capacity by roughly 20% and cost more than the ship's remaining operational value could ever recover. The world's largest ship had not been beaten by a rival vessel or a superior technology. She had been made obsolete by a pen stroke. In 2004, the Yara Viking made her last commercial voyage. She was sold, renamed the Nok Nevis, towed to the Al Shaheen oil field off Qatar, and permanently moored to the seabed. The ship that had once crossed oceans at 16 knots was now an anchored storage tank. Her propulsion turbines went cold. Her navigation systems were switched off. For 5 years she sat there, connected to underwater pipelines, pumping oil into vessels that came alongside, a stationary monument to an era of industrial scale that the world had decided it no longer wanted. In 2009, even that contract expired. She was sold to a maritime demolition company, renamed one final time as the Mont, and registered under the flag of Sierra Leone. In the shipping industry, that combination of signals means only one thing: This vessel is not coming back. The Alang ship breaking yard on the coast of Gujarat, India, is where large ships go to die. There are no dry docks here, no cranes positioned over still water, just a broad, shallow beach with an extreme tidal range and hundreds of workers with cutting torches. To beach a ship at Alang, you don't ease it in gently. You aim directly at the shoreline during the peak of a spring high tide and accelerate to maximum speed. The bow grinds into the coastal shelf. The momentum drives hundreds of thousands of tons of hull deep into the mud, and when the tide retreats, the ship is stranded permanently on dry land. That is how the Mont, formerly the Knock Nevis, formerly the Yar Viking, formerly the Seawise Giant, ended her life in 2010. Driven intentionally onto a beach by the crew that had sailed her to her own execution. What followed was less a demolition and more an archaeological dismantlement. Hundreds of workers climbed over the exposed hull with oxyacetylene torches and sledgehammers. They cut away the modern bridge superstructure that had been built in Singapore. They sliced through the deck plates that had survived Iraqi exocets. They worked their way down through the hull, section by section, deck by deck, week by week. Month by month, the 458-meter silhouette shrank. The steel, thousands of tons of it, high-tensile naval-grade plate that had been shaped in Japan, reinforced in Norway, and repaired in Singapore, was loaded onto flatbed trucks and driven to Indian foundries, where it was melted down and recast as construction rebar. The largest ship ever built became the foundations of buildings that will never know what they were made from. Today, there is almost nothing physical left of the Seawise Giant. Almost nothing except one object, her anchor. It weighs 36 tons, and it sits in the Hong Kong Maritime Museum. Removed from the wreck before demolition, preserved as the only surviving artifact of the most extraordinary vessel in the history of commercial shipping. An anchor without a ship. The Seawise Giant was built during an era when engineers believed that bigger was always better, when oil was cheap and environmental consequences were somebody else's problem. She was sunk by a war, raised by ambition, rebuilt by ingenuity, and finally killed by the same global consciousness that the Exxon Valdez had forced into existence. She was the first and the last of her kind. The forces that destroyed her, environmental regulation, geopolitical instability, the sheer physical impracticality of operating something that large, ensure that nothing like her will ever be built again. The ocean is a little emptier for it.